Welcome to Andy Staples On3. Happy Friday. Hope you are enjoying your holiday weekend. We have a very special presentation today. The My Favorite Game series is back. Remember I said if we didn't do your team the first time around, don't worry. We got a few more coming. This is a fun one. This one takes me back. I knew when I asked Tim Watts from BamaOnline for his favorite game, I was going to get one that probably would take me back to my childhood. He did not disappoint. The Miami-Alabama Sugar Bowl after the 1992 season. A lot of you probably weren't born yet, or you were too young to remember this. This was a really fun game. Crazy circumstances, crazy game, crazy result. If you listen to the narrative going into the game, it was a lot of fun. After that, Sean Callahan of HuskerOnline joins us to talk about the 2005 Alamo Bowl between Nebraska and Michigan. This was the first meeting between Nebraska and Michigan since they had split the national title in 1997. It's a Bill Callahan Nebraska team. Zach Taylor, current head coach of the Cincinnati Bengals, starting at quarterback for the Cornhuskers. A really loaded Michigan team and a play that almost was. And I think that's the theme. We have, in the Alabama-Miami game, the greatest play in college football history that didn't happen. And in the Alamo Bowl, the play that if one more thing had been done on it, we'd have never stopped talking about it. Let's talk first about that Sugar Bowl between Alabama and Miami after the 1992 season with Tim Watts from BamaOnline. All right. We've done these My Favorite Games where I think all of you remember what happened in this game. This time we're doing a game where a lot of you, I guarantee, were not born when this game happened. But I was a freshman in high school. I remember watching this with great interest. We won't say what grade Tim Watts was in, but Tim Watts from BamaOnline, your favorite game, the Sugar Bowl, after the 1992 season, happened in January 1993 between Alabama and Miami. What a game this was, because Tim, I don't know, you were older than me and probably a little more plugged in than I was at the time, but I seem to remember the national discourse that season being basically who's going to be the one that gets to get their butt kicked by Miami in the Sugar Bowl. It wasn't this is going to be a great game. It was whoever plays Miami is going to lose.
Yeah, they had that aura of invincibility. That was back, Dayton. It was the whole the starter jackets. Everybody had a Miami starter jacket and the matching hat. It looked so cool. FSU was another one. They looked so good together. You had people that were fans of other schools that actually wore those. They looked fantastic. They had incredible talent. They had swagger. They had, the first real taste of things are a little bit different in college football. And they beat Alabama the year before, and the stories there were they kind of bullied them. And I had friends that went to university and people that were there that talked about the Miami players kind of bullying them on, Bourbon Street, the whole, we're undefeated. So there's a lot of excitement going into this game, but I'm not sure how many people just straight up predicted Alabama to win it.
Well, and Alabama was coming off a very interesting game. The first of this crazy experiment called the SEC Championship game, where they had played Florida in an all-time classic game. Like, I wasn't, when I asked you for your favorite game, I had a feeling it would be one of two games from this season, either the one we're talking about or the SEC Championship game against Florida.
Yeah, and you beat Florida on a pick six. You know what I mean? You end the game in that. A very good game. I think people thought Alabama was going to, maybe that would be a little bit easier for Alabama at the time because they certainly had a great defense and Florida gave them trouble. But yeah, the first SEC Championship game, kind of an experiment, the way it ended, even the Auburn game, that was a 17-0 game from Alabama. Wasn't particularly pretty. You kind of knew what Bama was. Great defense, limited passing, really strong running game. And of course, David Palmer is that wild card.
Well, and that's the thing. So David Palmer is the exciting return man receiver. But if Alabama does what Alabama can do best, you don't even need him. But it's interesting how that all worked out, because Alabama's defense, 7 first-team All-SEC defenders were from Alabama's starting defense. 4 of those guys were All-Americans, including John Curry and Eric Copeland, Eric Curry and John Copeland, the 2 bookend defensive ends. They were awesome. Like that's the thing, Tim. This is a team, it's Gene Stallings' coach team. So Gene Stallings played for Bear Bryant, worked for Bear Bryant. This is a team that would have made Bear Bryant proud.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, that defense was so suffocating. You knew how good they were, but I mean, again, you're facing a Miami offense that was rocking and rolling. You had Gino Torretta, who was probably not even one of the top 5 players on that offense. Mario Cristobal, you had the receivers, you had all the production they did and everything they had. So you knew the defense was good. Hadn't really seen a team like this. I do think helped play in Florida. The game before helped them because you kind of saw some of that spread out offense. Spurrier was obviously an offensive genius, really could dial up a game as well. So when they walked into that, I mean, you were counting on the defense, you were counting on the running game. The one thing I think people forget is what the impact David Palmer had at all times. If he went in motion, it was a problem. There was nobody saying, don't worry about this guy. If he came in motion, if he lined up in the backfield, anything he did was a distraction for the defense. So he caused a lot of that middle to open up.
Well, and that was, they said, Keith Jackson and Bob Greasy during the game talking to Gene Stallings before the game. And Gene Stallings had noticed that when in the few times Miami had been given problems by anybody, I believe it was Syracuse, gave them some problems with misdirection. And so putting Palmer in motion, and then they added some traps where they had some pulling offensive linemen that Miami hadn't seen on film, and that became a problem for them as the game went on. But let's talk about Gino Torretta had won the Heisman. This was a very high-powered offense. I'm with you. I kind of think having had to play Shane Matthews in Florida the previous game was very helpful for that Alabama defense because it proved to them, hey, we can play with a high-powered passing offense. Also, we can turn that to our advantage. We can bait that QB into throwing balls that we can turn into interceptions that can be huge momentum swing plays.
Yeah, you could tell how well there's coached. I mean, you pick out several plays. I mean, the Teague interception where he read the short route, which they had success on earlier in the game a couple of times, taking those quick wide receivers, a short pass, and getting up the middle, finding a lane. But yeah, Teague read that play. If you watch that, he literally boxes him out. He knows where that play's coming. He knows that pass rush is getting to Gino Torretta, so he's not going to have, 5 Mississippi to sit back there and throw the ball. So he's got to get that thing out. George Teague anticipated it. I tell you the one thing people kind of missed that I noticed when I rewatched this was the swagger of the Bama touchdowns was like Miami, the high stepping into the end zone, the Sherman shake, the Lassick quake. They were feeling themselves in their game. There was a lot of confidence in that Alabama team that the fans might not have known, but there was a year's worth of pent up anxiety they wanted to release on them.
Well, the Bama defense was every bit as swaggy as Miami's whole team. And that's what, because they were the best defense in the country. It wasn't close. Like everybody knew this. And you had the basically won the SEC championship game on the Antonio Langham interception. You mentioned George Teague. The play you're talking about is a pick 6 against Miami in the Sugar Bowl that essentially ends the game. Now the play hasn't happened yet.
Yeah,
that's the best play that never counted. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But this game includes the greatest play that never counted. But on the play you're talking about, George Teague is in the slot, essentially on the line of scrimmage, and it looks like he's about to blitz. And we don't know. It's sort of lost to time. Did he have the option to blitz? Was he supposed to blitz? And then he noticed that they were about to throw to the guy right over him, and he stopped. Whatever it was either a disguise that fooled Gino Torretta, or it was a decision by George Teague to not blitz and to jump in front of that route. But that was the game right there.
It hit him right in the chest. I mean, he was sitting right there waiting on it. He wasn't just defending him. He was looking for that pass because, that's a short pass and a hard thrown pass. And he picked it and knew exactly where to run, knew exactly which sideline to go to. So I just think, Sam Shade had a great pick on another play where they read the route. And You know,
Oh, they were baiting Gino Torretta all night, and that's
the
what.
whole
So
night.
let's go back to the beginning of the game. So one thing I think is really interesting: the first couple of kickoffs that Alabama had, George Teague makes the tackle.
Yes, that
A
stood
little
out
bit of
to
a
you.
tone setter there.
Yeah.
But Miami gets into its first possession. Eric Curry and John Copeland are just all over Torretta. It was funny because they show the Gino Torretta graphic on screen, how great he's been as the starter. He won the Heisman Trophy. The next image you see is the huddle, and it's Mario Cristobal standing in the huddle. He's the starting right tackle for Miami in this game. He had been hurt that season. They'd had to play some freshmen, but he was back, and they had a 5 senior offensive line. And you're like, okay, if anybody can handle these 2 defensive ends, it's these guys. And within 3 plays, you knew they can't handle them.
Yeah, I think it's underappreciated. I mean, they always say the pass rush makes every cornerback, every secondary better. Alabama had I think most of them played in the NFL, had a great secondary and a front. So you mix that together. Gino's having to make quick decisions where he's not actually seeing them open. I think he's actually hoping they're open. And then again, you also get, which we really don't talk about much, is that David Palmer punt return, getting them deep right out of the gate. Boom, boom, inside the 10. And they missed a touchdown. That was I can't remember.
Barker had it wide open. He got it deflected.
Open, and that athletic defense, Miami, Miami doesn't get enough credit. Alabama didn't even have 300 total yards in that game. They did a good job. People act like the score, it looks like Bama blew them out. And they did. But a lot of that was defense. Miami's defense was nasty. They had hit you. They were fast. On that play alone, 9 out of 10 times, that's a touchdown. Very athletic play, jumped up, knocked it down, held him to 3 points right out of the gate.
So Michael Barrow, Kevin Patrick, Darren Crine, these are guys playing for that Miami defense. They were awesome. There was a backup, and I, actually when the game got out of hand, I started looking for number 94 to see if he got in the game. Do you know who number 94 for Miami was?
I want to guess it's The Rock. I'm not sure.
It was.
Is it
Dwayne
The Rock?
Johnson?
I thought it's so many. This is like rewatching this game is literally like going back and watching an old classic movie. The cameos were unbelievable. Yes. Players you saw, Mario Cristobal, The Rock, those guys. It's amazing to know they were out there on that field.
There's a scene when they're showing Sonny Lubick because he was the defensive coordinator for Miami. He's working in the press box. So they're talking about how Sonny Lubick is about to leave to become the head coach of Colorado State, where, by the way, he will help guide the career of a young Urban Meyer, who will be his receivers coach at Colorado State on that staff. But Tommy Tuberville is about to become the defensive coordinator at Miami, which then allows him to become the head coach at Ole Miss, the head coach at Auburn, United States Senator. It just goes on and on. So, but it was crazy. And you got Keith Jackson making fun of Tommy Tuberville's golf game in the middle of the game.
A lot happened, and that first half is terribly boring. I mean, if you're an old school defensive guy, which a lot of people were back then, especially Alabama fans, you were loving it. But it was a boring get inside the 10, kick a field goal. Pruitt was a hunt. I think he played with Jay Barker at Hewitt Trussville. In fact,
yes,
he's Miami's kicker. Yeah, there's another degree connecting them together. Couple field goals go back and forth, but going into that halftime towards the end, it was kind of a boring football game unless you love defense. But the defenses on both sides were physical, hard-hitting, fast, talented guys that played in the NFL. A lot of those tackles are illegal now. I saw Gino Torretta take off on the scramble in the third, I think, and he slid and he was hit. There'd have been 15 penalties on them hitting him when he was.
You have flags just coming from every direction.
Nobody had a flag in their pocket after that.
Well, and do you remember at the beginning of the game, Jack Arut's doing his first sideline report, and so Rogers Redding, who was a Southwest Conference official, winds up becoming the SEC director of officials years later. But he says he's not going to invoke the noise rule. And I had forgotten there was a rule where you could penalize a crowd for making too much noise.
Yes, totally quiet. I mean, it was so different. I mean, it's literally a different world watching everything from the neck rolls, to Houston running, looking like a daggone middle linebacker in the 60s, just the whole the way it looked. But I'll tell you one thing that still holds up from that game to today was the athletes, because they were peppered across the field.
David Palmer and Kevin Williams would fit in so
Oh,
perfectly
Kevin
with
Williams
any
punt.
offense
I
today.
don't
That Kevin Williams punt return for Miami
skipping
was
ahead. Are you kidding?
incredible.
There's no way he should have scored. There's 5 reasons he shouldn't have scored. That was a punt return for the ages. Went after the fact, but I mean, we're skipping ahead to the third quarter. But they had guys out there that could do so many things, and they could do it today. If they were if they were 18 to 22 today, they'd still be at Alabama and Miami places.
Well, so you're right. The first quarter or first half was a fairly boring half. The most interesting thing I think that you heard in the whole first half is Keith Jackson. They're showing Sebastian the ibis. He's doing the thing with his beak where he bends it back and forth, and Keith Jackson just goes, "Quite a story about that fellow who wears the ibis suit." And Bob Greasy launches into the story of the guy who plays Sebastian the Ibis was hanging out on, I think on Bourbon Street, somewhere in New Orleans that week. And someone had fired a gunshot in the air in celebration, as one does, apparently. And the bullet had come straight out of the sky.
That's crazy.
And grazed the fellow who plays Sebastian the Ibis. But because he's a pro, he was in costume during the game.
Yeah, I mean, it was back and forth field goals that whole game. It was more of the sideshow that you were watching, the fans, the action on the sidelines. I mean, you got, and you had Erickson. Yeah, I was about to say he's wearing a starter jacket and Gene
Stallings, the last coach to win a national title in a suit, by the way.
He's a full suit versus starter jacket. I mean, they're really, the contrast between the two teams on the surface couldn't have been greater. I think after that, though, I think when you get to the players, you could have stripped them down, put them in other uniforms, and they'd have been the unbelievable teams. You could have seen it. But Bama did have more swagger than I thought. But every yard was earned. I mean, that first that touchdown in the first half, Bama got, that didn't come easy. And several times you felt like Bama was knocking on the door and should have scored and ended up with field goals. But I think you almost think, well, you missed your opportunity. You missed your opportunity.
It was. You didn't just say it's over, Bama's going to win this thing, because Miami's offense was so high powered that they could score quickly. But the thing that kind of gave away what was about to happen early on is Miami starts running these timing routes. They start running these underneath little screens, things to let Torretta complete passes, because they just couldn't, he could not take a snap, drop back, go through his progressions and throw the ball, because there was not time. And he was getting confused because the pass rush was so ferocious. And then Bama was doing stuff in the secondary to confuse him. They were out of timeouts in the first half with 9 minutes and 20 seconds to go. Out of timeouts.
Yeah. If you could have used all 6 of your timeouts in the first half, Miami would have had none at halftime. It was that confusing. And again, I think that made a big difference. I always thought, I think looking back, Gino Torretta and Jay Barker are both what we'd consider system quarterbacks. But I do think when Gino Torretta had time, he could pick you apart. Those guys, you can't guard those wide receivers 4, 5, 6 seconds. If you're sitting back there counting one Mississippi, to 5, you're gonna find a guy that's open. He just didn't have that option. He was literally having to guess, is this guy open? He's been open since the day I met him, and Alabama did a good job of making sure that wasn't the case.
Yeah, and Derek Lassick for Alabama and the Alabama offensive line were the ones that kept things going, because Jay Barker had a horrendous game. I've got the final stats of this game up. It is, Jay Barker was flat out awful in this game.
Yeah, there's not another word. Yeah, that's a kind word. He threw an interception, and Keith Jackson, rest in peace, is the great, always going to be the voice I hear with that. Very complimentary, found the positive, very subdued, but he said it was an awful pass on the interception. And then he repeated, it's an awful pass. He like, it wasn't just awful. This is like awful. Like Keith Jackson never said that on that interception. He's like, this is bad. This is really bad. So
Jay Barker was 4 of 13 for 18 yards with 2 interceptions and 0 touchdowns on the game. He ran for 19 yards on the game.
He had a couple good scrambles, though, to keep him alive.
He's a good athlete.
Yeah.
But Derek Lassick was the guy who was the engine driving Alabama's offense. With midway through the second quarter, he carried 15 times for 105 yards. Midway through the second quarter. But you still couldn't you just couldn't penetrate. Like when you got into the red zone, that Miami defense was impossible to penetrate, it felt like. And so they run Lassick at him a bunch of times down there. Finally, they give it to Sherman Williams on a lead play.
Yeah.
And he gets into the end zone. And that's where I would imagine if you're a Bama fan, you kind of start to relax. Like, okay, you could. There's not a force field on the goal line, at least.
A field goal there. You go into the half without that touchdown. I mean, you're worried. Again, you keep saying you missed your opportunity. You missed your opportunity. I think for Jay, to defend him a little bit, I think he was in that almost A.J. McCarron, Nick Saban mode of don't mess up.
Yeah.
Don't hurt us. Don't mess up. I mean, late in the game, he had Palmer wide open on a play and ended up not throwing it because he didn't want to throw it across that middle, because you know what happens across that middle with that, that secondary when it's that exciting. We know exactly what happened because it happened to Gino Torretta. So better safe than sorry. He also didn't have the wide receivers that Gino had, but he did have a running game that Gino had. I'll tell you one thing that stood out to me in this game was like, these were brick wall tackles. Like we're used to seeing people grab you and pull you to the ground. These guys would hit each other and the ball stopped. They were hitting you. It was like head-to-head, the Oklahoma drill. It was head-to-head collisions. You don't see it much anymore. You see guys grab them, wrap them up.
Well, you don't tackle that way anymore. So in that era, that's when you were taught to tackle, where you put your face mask in the middle of the guy's chest and try to make his heart explode.
Put your helmet in his chest, head down, just and they were doing it. They were stopping. I mean, there were some massive hits, those linebackers on both sides. But I think a big part of this was Alabama was just pissed. They were mad, they were embarrassed, they were shamed, they were motivated. I felt they'd been more battle tested. Auburn, a lot of those teams they played were good games, they'd been tested. But I think that chip on the shoulder, you spend a year preparing to fight somebody, you probably have an advantage because they haven't spent a year thinking about you. They beat you. They haven't spent Alabama probably spent an entire year. I wonder how many times they had to watch that 92 Sugar Bowl to get to the 93 Sugar Bowl. I bet they saw that a few times.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about, but that was kind of a revenge tour for Alabama because they had lost 35-0 to Florida the previous year as well. So they were getting their revenge as they went. So that touchdown I mentioned, the first touchdown Alabama had, got set up by a Sam Shade interception of Gino Torretta. You flash forward to Miami kicks a field goal at the end of the first half. It's 13-6 Bama, so it's still very much a game. The first pass of the third quarter for Gino Torretta, intercepted by Tommy Johnson. And again, though, they get into the red zone. And this is another Keith Jackson. It's like trying to climb a cactus to score against this Miami defense.
Yeah.
Lassick scores on the next play. And it's like, okay, all right. Alabama's going to be okay here.
Also, I think one big difference is like Alabama's interceptions turned into instant offense. They were moving the ball up the field. Miami had the interception on the sideline where they caught it, fell out of bounds. Bama was catching these balls and advancing it up the field, which is what you're trying to do. You're trying to punt further than they are, defend their guy. You're trying to return the punt a little bit further than they are. You're kind of just leaning on each other like an old school chess match and hoping it busted open. But that's exactly right. When they picked off passes, Sam's another one, ran the route, turned it straight up the field. I mean, that was instant offense right away.
Yeah. And all of these interceptions we're talking about, by the way, were right in the defender's chest because Gino Torretta thought he had an open receiver. And those Bama players were sitting back waiting to jump the route.
They were running the routes. They knew what was coming. That's one thing they did really well. Miami actually had more offense than Alabama did. Now they had the ball more because Alabama kept flipping the field and keeping the offense off the field. They had more possessions, but it was a complete. I felt bad for Gino Torretta at one point because he looked lost at one point of the game. He just knew, like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here.
Yeah, he kept going back to the bench after each one of these picks and, like, just putting his head down. Like, I can't, there's nothing I can do here. And so the next pass he throws. So Lassick scores to make it 20-6 Bama. Bama kicks off. Miami gets the ball. The next pass he throws is the one to George Teague that we talked about. And we're talking about a 3-yard pass. We're talking about a pass. Well, maybe 3 yards total in the air. It's like a yard past the line of scrimmage. Yeah. And
it's where the linebacker should have been. It's where they cleared the linebacker, but George was standing there grinning, Yeah, and
It
again,
was
we read that. I mean, I know the play in that game is the play that never was. But that play, like you said, won the game. That play said, "There's literally nothing y'all can do against us to beat us." That's what it said. You can't throw long, you can't throw wide, you can't throw short, you can't do anything. We're taking it
yeah.
all away from you.
So this makes it 27-6 Alabama, but it's again, there's still so much time. This is a good offense. You're not completely convinced it's over. Now we get to the play that never happened. The coolest play that never happened in college football history. So it's the next series. Gino Torretta throws his best pass of the night. This is a beautiful throw to Lamar Thomas down the left sideline. Gorgeous throw. When Lamar Thomas catches the ball, it looks like it is going to be a walk-in touchdown. But George Teague, who we've mentioned, has been all over the field tonight. George Teague runs him down, doesn't do the chop on the ball, reaches in, grabs the ball, and turns and starts running in the other direction.
Yeah, and the thing
Never seen that before in my life.
Lamar's a strider. We're not talking about some 4'9" guy he's chasing down. I mean, this is a guy hitting stride, striding out. I mean, you go back, I think a lot of people have seen the cheerleader. I think the cheerleader on the sideline, if you ever, I've seen that gif several times. She is celebrating, jumping, and her face said, "Oh Lord, what is happening?" And then she's like, she described the play because, like you said, a lot of those guys are doing what? They're grabbing at his legs to bring him down. George Teague was pissed. You had his ball and he went and got it back.
So now, if you've been listening carefully, Keith Jackson says flag down right after the snap of that play before Gino throws the ball. So there's something that's coming. There's an announcement. And so it's Rogers Reading. We have offsides on the defense, 5-yard penalty, replay second down. And the air comes out of the stadium. But here's the thing. Though that play does not officially count, what happened on that play told Miami, you're done here. You have no chance. You will never come back in this game. This is Alabama's game. It's over. And the next play, Torretta is getting buried as he throws a duck, like a wobbly duck that falls incomplete. And it's like, okay, it's done now.
Lamar's reaction told you, because he was laying on the field. That's never happened to him, right?
Yeah.
That never happened to him at any level of football. Couldn't believe it happened then. Total disbelief. And like you said, they got the ball back, but it was like, do we even want the ball back? You know what I'm saying? Like, what is going to happen? What can we do from here to do anything?
Like Kevin Williams scored on that great punt return we talked about, but then Alabama gets the ball, converts a fourth down at midfield, and just drives forever to score a touchdown and basically win the game. The next thing you do is you're just looking at what's happening. Like Rohan Marley comes in the game for Miami, Bob Marley's son.
Bob Marley's son, again, cameo.
Yep. And Dwayne Johnson got in. He got in garbage time. And speaking of garbage time, before we get finished talking about this game, one of the things I thought was the most telling thing about this Alabama defense in this game, like Antonio Langham comes back into the game on Miami's final drive. They will not let them score a garbage touchdown. They won't do it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, even when Kevin scored, there's still 12 minutes left. I mean, that was a time where you thought maybe get some momentum. You get one turnover, you flip that field 14-0, you think you're in it. But no, like I said, Bama was mad about the 13, I think, at the end of the game. But they certainly, at the very end, they didn't want to give up a point. George Teague, again, that was anger that chased down Lamar Thomas. Like, no, not in my house. Just a lot of built up emotions from the year before. And also, this is why it's hard to repeat, right? One has a chip on their shoulder and one really doesn't have a chip on their shoulder at the same time. That's why it makes it so hard to repeat in sports. But again, what was that point spread? I don't even remember. It was a big enough one that there was a lot of people.
It was a situation where nobody thought Alabama had a chance, probably except the Alabama folks. Very similar. So it felt similar to 2001 Miami, where we just assumed they were they were headed toward a coronation and nobody could beat them. Now, I don't think there was anybody who could beat them. I covered the Tennessee team that would have played them in the Rose Bowl had they not lost to LSU in the SEC championship game. That team probably had the personnel best suited to compete with that Miami team. It would have lost. Like, Miami would have won. The only other time when I remember it being like that was 2006, when everybody assumed that the winner of the Michigan-Ohio State game was going to clobber anybody they played. And Ohio State wins that game, goes to the national title game, and gets crushed by Florida. But that's the only other time I remember it being like that. The 2006 national championship game with Florida and Ohio State, and this one with Alabama and Miami.
I mean, Geno threw almost 60 times. He closed it on 60 passes in that game. I mean, it wasn't that Miami didn't want to run the ball. They absolutely wouldn't want to, run the ball and establish that to feed your offense off of it, your passing game off of it. But man, let me tell you that there was nothing happening on the ground. So they went straight pass, and you kept, and to be honest with them, they did have some big hits. They had one to Kevin Williams, I believe, in the first half. To Lamar Thomas would have been some big hits. At that point, you're just playing roulette, betting on black. Just throw it.
Yeah.
Try to find a guy. And that secondary first of all, it was extremely talented. We're barely talking about Sam Shade. That's how good it was. That was a good football player.
Antonio Langham.
I mean, these are for George Teague's a first round pick. We all remember him with the Cowboys, especially, George was that guy, right? Remember with the Cowboys, T.O. celebrated on the star and George just went out and clobbered it. He was always that guy, chip on his shoulder. So secondary was incredible. I don't even remember the linebackers hardly making plays. I know they did, but between the front, the defensive line, and the back end, there was not a lot of action for them.
Yeah, and the difference really was a very good Miami defensive front got pushed around by Alabama's offensive line. Like, Alabama's offensive line was resetting the line of scrimmage, especially early on a lot of those Derek Lassick runs, and Miami could never do that. And basically stopped trying after a while. And a lot of it was the circumstance of the game. The score got away from them. They had to throw. But they could not reset the line of scrimmage against Alabama's front. Couldn't do it. So
there was a good bit of them stunned that Alabama was standing. I mean, this wasn't a rock fight. They were standing in the pocket throwing fists. Just two guys throwing fists. I don't think Miami was expecting that. And again, the year before, all the talk we heard was Alabama kind of got bullied. Bourbon Street kind of had some things happen. And, I mean, you get out there, you don't really expect that. But, I mean, there were some nasty guys on that Alabama team. That defense, and again, the offensive line deserves a lot of credit. Lassick ran so hard. Sherman was against the odds with his size. Everything was hard for him to earn. But Lassick, and, a lot of that came putting Palmer in motion and making a linebacker chase him to some degree, reset that defense, because if he could get by that first wave, he was in trouble, and that guy could play some football.
Well, so that previous Sugar Bowl between Miami and Alabama was actually after the 89 season. And so, like, Alabama's best players had been young watching that happen.
Oh, that's even a better point.
Yeah, and so they made sure that it didn't happen again.
Yeah, and there was a lot. Yeah, there was a lot of talking. There was a lot of talk about that for years going into that game. That was all the talk. And I mean, you're right. The younger guys being older, a lot of these guys were seniors. A lot of times in football back then, especially, you were kind of dependent on the age of your team, right? You wanted to.
Yeah.
You had those teams that won a lot of games with juniors and seniors. It's changed now. Freshmen impact the game so much more. But yeah, a lot of those guys, Jay Barker, a lot of those guys had been there and had to watch that on the sideline. I mean, there was just and also the Miami mystique. And it's hard even now knowing there's not a Miami mystique, to be honest with you, because it was so deep when you and I were growing up. But that Miami mystique, no matter what their record was, you wanted to fight them. I mean, because you've grown up your whole life, they're fighting in the Cotton Bowl, they're fighting here. They had
they felt unbeatable, or like score in the Cotton Bowl and run through the tunnel out of the stadium. Like they just now. I think there would be a little different feel. Like they wouldn't be cast as villains completely now. Like now it would be 50-50. Like people love their anti-heroes now. Like they would have been beloved by 50% of the fans nationally and hated by 50% of the fans. But back then it was much more of a, white hat, black hat kind of thing. And Miami was always cast as the villain. And in this case, they had been so good. It was hard to imagine anybody challenging them, much less doing what Alabama did. which is kick their ass.
I didn't think Miami, like overall, were players were like bad. I just thought they were extremely cocky, and they had a right to be. I mean, everything they did, the dancing and stuff, they were different. Um, and that was a different era. I mean, going back to date us, I mean, music had changed and the way we were dressing had changed and
Mm-hmm.
pop culture had changed, and they kind of led the way. You had the Two Live Crew. There was a lot going on for us
Oh
that
yeah.
were between, you're between 15 and 25 in that age. You had a lot going on, and Miami kind of personified that. A lot of those
Well,
guys
they,
did
they
fine
set
later on in
every
their career.
trend in the sport
Yeah.
for a long time.
Yeah, and
And
at the time you hated them because they scored and they said I'm better than you, and then they were better than you. And you went through this different subject, but the Fab Five at Michigan did it. Remember the
yep.
black socks, long
This
pants.
is the same set of years here. Yeah.
So they did it, and you kind of thought they were the bad boys. But I mean, we see them now. How many of those guys were bad boys? Jalen Rose,
None.
he's at the top of his business. Chris Webber, all those guys. Juwan Howard's been a coach, but at the time it was so different. I think that was the whole. That was still the time where if you hit a home run, they hit you in the face with a baseball. You know what I mean?
Right.
You
Not,
didn't
not,
even.
not if you flip the bat.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
because you hit the home run.
There was no. You had the nerve to hit him. There was no backflip. He was just running to first as fast as he could. Next time you're drilling him. So everything was be humble, and they didn't really feel like I mean, Greg Olson. He's a guy that's about as pure as you can find. He's in you got to look it up, but he's in quite the rap song back in the day.
Oh yeah, the 7th Floor Crew, baby.
Yeah. 7th Floor Crew. You got Greg in that. You watch that documentary, you're like, what's going on right now? You're like shocked.
Well, it was a cathartic moment for the people who didn't like Miami to see. They had been beaten by Penn State, a few years earlier in the Fiesta Bowl in a similar fashion, but this was an absolute ass kicking, and so this is also a big one for Alabama because this was the first national title without Bear Bryant,
and in a while, yeah,
it was such a big moment for them, and it told them, okay, it doesn't have to be with Bear Bryant. It can happen without him. And I think the thought was this will keep going. It didn't. It didn't happen again until Nick Saban did it in 2009. But it was quite a moment for the Crimson Tide.
Yeah, and also, I mean, that's an old school, and everything again has changed. That's an old school fan's dream because you want to win just like they won. You want to play great defense. You want to bring the helmet, get behind your pads, all the old school things. You want to run the ball. You don't want to score 45 points. You don't want to pass 50 times in a game if you're an Alabama fan because you grew up completely different to that. I mean, think when Saban finally did it. When you had the rideouts, when you had all those guys, Judy, Amari, all those guys, and you had, Blake dropping back and just dropping dime after dime to Amari Cooper, you had all that going on. There was a big change of like wanting the defense back. And I think that's always been that way for Bama fans because of the tradition of defense. The Penn State goal line stand, you look at the history of a lot of those plays. A lot of the plays have always been for Alabama have been long field goals or great defensive plays. I mean, even this game, George Teague's, the play that wasn't. I mean, all those things stand out to Alabama fan and endears these team to them.
Here's the thing, though, Tim. The world always changes. There's a 30-year-old Alabama fan right now who in 10, 15 years is going to be over the moon if Alabama wins a national title by scoring 50 points.
If I showed my children,
that's what I remember. That's what Devontae did.
Yeah, if I showed my children that 92 game, they would be bored. I would literally have to make them watch that game. They would not, because they are just from, Tua, Pat Mahomes. Everything that's happening now is just so different for Alabama, the SEC, everything. They would be hard to watch. But rewatching it was great memories for me. I know you obviously felt the same. Just the build up into it brought back a lot of memories. And again, a blasted moment for Alabama because you thought, hey, we're back. And then it did take a while. And, the other game I was looking at, Florida was one, but also the Texas game would have been a game I thought about discussing. I probably would have discussed that if Colt had played. That probably would have won it and Alabama won. But this one, I mean, if you said pick one game that stands out, this is the first one that jumped to my mind.
Well, I appreciate it, Tim. It certainly didn't feel like doing homework for me because I remember that game vividly watching that game going when George Teague took that ball. Thank you, Tim. Appreciate it.
You got it, man. Anytime. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Tim Watts, for taking us down memory lane. Now we go slightly less far back, but I imagine there's a lot of you that are probably still too young to remember this one. 2005, Nebraska, Michigan, Alamo Bowl. Bill Callahan era Nebraska. It was a short time, but a lot was going on. We'll talk about that with Sean Callahan of HuskerOnline. We go to my favorite game. That this is kind of what this series was made for. We have the huge games, the ones that everybody remembers watching, but there's also these little quirky ones that it's somebody's favorite, and it's a lot of fans of the team we're talking about. It's their favorite game, but maybe you didn't watch it, or maybe you don't even remember watching this one. But I guarantee you saw the ending to this one. And if it had gone a little bit differently, it's one of those endings that would be replayed every single year. It would be a world famous all-time college football play. But if it had worked, we wouldn't be having Sean Callahan on to talk about it. Sean Callahan from HuskerOnline. We're talking, of course, of the 2005 Michigan-Nebraska Alamo Bowl. And before we get started, Sean, I want to explain. We'll take the folks behind the curtain, because I gave you the option of picking your game, and you said it was either going to be this one or it's going to be the 2009 Big 12 championship game. And my thing was, I don't know if we can do a game Nebraska lost, but I was thinking about it. That the 2009 Big 12 championship game, everybody seen Ndamukong Suh against Texas, crazy game. I didn't want a bunch of Nebraska fans mad at me afterward, but I see where you're going with, where you're going with that.
In the context, that one extra second that was put on the clock that allowed Texas to win the game, that was kind of the domino that began conference realignment. Nebraska felt like the Big 12 was against them, and everything was kind of going against them at that point. And their star had really risen to its highest point with Ndamukong Suh, and they became very attractive. And the Big 10, once they showed interest, was interested in them. And that was really, I mean, you can argue Colorado and some other teams also left at that point, but Nebraska losing to Texas that night, what I felt like was an ultimate domino that began this conference realignment world that we live today still.
Yeah. And the Big 10 shortly after that puts out a release basically saying, hey, we're in the market for more schools. Nebraska was the school they wound up taking at that time. But yeah, I had a hard time doing one that they lost. I wanted to do one that they won. And I want to talk to you about this, Sean, because, we've done a few of these and you've been covering the Huskers for a long time, but I think, a lot of people would say, well, how come not the 95, the national title game after the 94 or the 95 season? How come not one of those Orange Bowls? How many Nebraska fans really remember that? Like, if we're talking about the age range of the people who might watch this show.
Right. I mean, you're right. I mean, you're talking several years ago, and I was in 8th grade when they won the 95 national championship, and sophomore year in high school when they won the 97. And I'm going to turn 44 this year. So you're dating yourself a little bit. And those were special wins. There's no doubt about it. I mean, seeing Nebraska go into Miami in the Orange Bowl and beat Warren Sapp and Ray Lewis in the manner they did, with essentially fullback trap plays to Corey Schlesinger.
Corey Schlesinger, I love that game.
And Warren Sapp running out of gas late in that game. I mean, that was a legendary scene on the sideline of Warren Sapp having to take oxygen because he was so exhausted by the end of that game. And the Peyton Manning win in 97. You're right. I mean, those are legendary wins in this program. That's why there still is great hope and optimism for this team to this day, because so many people lived that era and they know how special this place can be if Nebraska got back competing at that level again.
Well, let's set up the game we're going to talk about. This is 2005 Alamo Bowl, Nebraska, Michigan. Both teams are 7-4. Michigan has not had a great year. They're about to be really good the following year. 2006, it's basically a collision course between Michigan and Ohio State to see who's going to play for the national. Whoever wins the Big 10 is playing for the national title. And this is the guts of that team. Chad Henne, Mike Hart, Jake Long, Mario Manningham, Steve, I think Steve Breston was a senior, but like Alan Branch, Lamar Woodley, this is a good Michigan team. And then Nebraska is in year 2 of Bill Callahan. So like, I imagine it's still really weird at this point for Nebraska fans to watch this style of football after seeing Osborne and Frank Solich and the option for so long.
Yeah, this was year 2 of Bill Callahan, and year 1 was really tough because they didn't have a quarterback. They tried to bring in a junior quarterback at that time named Jordan Adams, and he got mono and had to have, I believe, his spleen removed.
Oh God.
And so like that, he never competed for the job. So they had to go with Joe Daly as their quarterback, and he was not a West Coast offense quarterback. And Bill Callahan really, really tried to make that work. It didn't work in 2004. They added a Harrison Beck as their prize recruit for 2005, but then out of nowhere late, they take this guy by the name of Zach Taylor. He grew up next door neighbors to Gary Gibbs in Norman, Oklahoma. His dad was a captain for Barry Switzer in the 70s. So he was a true Oklahoma Sooner fan. In fact, in 2004, he watched the Nebraska-Oklahoma game in the stands in Norman as an OU fan on a break from Butler Community College. Then by 2005, he was the starting quarterback against Nebraska against Oklahoma.
That it's crazy. So Zach Taylor went to Norman High School in Norman, Oklahoma, goes to Wake Forest out of high school, leaves Wake Forest, goes to JUCO, winds up going to Nebraska because, Bill Callahan feels like he's a better trigger man for the offense. Now, if you're going Zach Taylor, that name's familiar. Yes, we are talking about the Cincinnati Bengals head coach.
Yeah, Zach Taylor, and they wanted a mature quarterback, kind of a guy that knew how to run a complicated offense. Well, he's obviously that to this day. He's a very good offensive coordinator in the NFL. So Zach Taylor comes in, wins the job, gets off to somewhat of a slow start, just learning this offense that Bill Callahan was literally running with the Raiders 2 years before that in the Super Bowl. And it took somebody like Zach Taylor. And as that year moved on, you started to see Zach Taylor get better and better and better, to the point where it really peaked at Colorado. Nebraska was a 2-touchdown underdog in Boulder against a Colorado team that had already clinched the Big 12 North at that time. And they went in there and won by like 30 points. They called it the Restore the Order game at that time. And they had t-shirts but Zach Taylor was unbelievable. And then that kind of carried over to the bowl game where they get this opportunity to play Michigan, who really didn't want to be in the Alamo Bowl, or Nebraska. No. They were excited to get back to a bowl game because they didn't make a bowl game in 2004.
Yeah, Michigan had a disappointing season. Like Jake Long, for example, was the right tackle that year. He becomes the left tackle after this. He goes on to be the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. But he was out a lot of that season, which they felt hamstrung their offense. One thing I noticed watching this game, Sean, though, very aesthetically pleasing football. Like for some reason, I was remembering Lloyd Carr era at Michigan as a kind of boring, but like their offense was fun to watch.
The way he used the tight ends in that game too. I mean, he had a lot of great concepts, and I mean the speed that Michigan had at skill.
Yeah.
And Nebraska didn't have near the talent of Michigan in that game. And Bill Callahan schematically figured out a way to put them in place. And they felt like the Michigan defense was talented, but they couldn't run very well. So their whole plan was Corey Ross was finally healthy and running really well at that point. And they're like, we're going to really make them chase Corey Ross, who was, he was like a 5'4" running back, almost like a heavier.
I love Corey Ross. I had forgotten till I rewatched this game how much I loved watching Corey Ross run.
He was like Deuce Vaughn, a little heavier. His nickname was Pork Chop, and Pork Chop just ran all over Michigan in that game. And, they tired out, and then Zach Taylor got hot, and Bill Callahan knew how to Bill Callahan could draw up plays as well as anybody, and
still can.
And he knew exactly how to go at Michigan and attacked what they were doing because of that NFL kind of preparation mentality he had. And there was never a better coach at a 15 play script than Bill Callahan. His out of the gate scripts were some of the best you'll ever see. And he came in with a plan on how to go at Michigan. This is a Michigan team that probably had 20 or 30 NFL draft picks on its roster.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. So again, like I said, they were a very good team in 2006, this Michigan team. And a lot of these guys were on the 2007 team that lost to Appalachian State. And they got crushed by, Oregon, which had just gotten Chip Kelly as the OC, but then went on to have an incredible year in 2007 after the horrific start. So like these were really good players. You're not kidding. Like you're talking about big time NFL players here.
And Nebraska didn't. I mean, Nebraska had some NFL talent. Like Ndamukong Suh was a true freshman, I believe, on this Nebraska 05 team. And you had, they had this 05 recruiting class is still the gold standard of recruiting classes. It produced 2 Big 12 players of the year, Ndamukong Suh and Zach Taylor. Zach Taylor is still the last Nebraska player to win a conference player of the year on offense. So, that's 06 when he won that award. But that team had Bill Callahan built a really good team, and that was like the beginning of it. It just the 07 season, obviously, they never could overcome that because in 06, they played with anybody on their schedule, and they easily could have been a 12-win team in 06, and they blew a couple of games late that kind of changed the course of that year. But that 05 team, I think, really showed you what they could be. They matched up really well defensively against Michigan, even though Michigan had significant advantages in some of the skill position players and their offensive line play. But Nebraska still got lots of pressure on Chad Henne in that game.
Oh, yeah. And that's very important. Like, as we talk about the game, there's one play in particular late in the game, like Nebraska does not win this game without the pressure it's getting. But you mentioned that Bill Callahan was a great, opening script guy, and that Nebraska struck first in this game, busted coverage right over the middle. It was like, okay, this might look easy.
Yeah, he came out and just knew how to go at their coverages. And, keep in mind, Kevin Cosgrove, the defensive coordinator, was at Wisconsin for many years. So, and Bill Callahan had a Big Ten background. So they had a lot of familiarity with Michigan on that staff at Nebraska. Phil Almatian was at Purdue. You go down the line, they had a number of guys on that Nebraska 05 staff that were very aware of Michigan and kind of how they operated, because they didn't really change a lot at Michigan over that time. I mean, they were very traditional, very buttoned up. And Nebraska had never been that style. And Nebraska has never been a pro style program until Bill Callahan gets there. So, he takes out like what Frank Solich and Osborne had done for years and, puts them in this pro style system. And it was a massive adjustment. But eventually it started to take hold, and it started with the quarterback play. I mean, Zach Taylor could at least get the ball out and operate. He didn't have a pro arm, but he had an elite mind, and he could get the ball out.
Yeah, because you could see that. You can see that watching this game, because like you said, the Michigan defensive players are more talented than their Nebraska counterparts on offense. But Zach Taylor is so good at knowing where to go with the ball and when to do it that it sort of negates that physical advantage that Michigan had. Now, not always, because so Nebraska scores, and then it becomes Zach Taylor throwing to Leon Hall. Like, he throws to Leon Hall and gets picked. Michigan misses a chip shot field goal, which becomes very important later. Then he throws another pick to Leon Hall, and this time Michigan scores, and then you got a tie game.
Yeah, Nebraska overcame a lot of. I remember thinking to myself, there was a point in that game like, it's over. Nebraska's not going to win this game. I mean, you could just sense it tilting to Michigan at points. Even late in the fourth quarter, it felt like Michigan had the game won, or in parts of the fourth quarter. So for it all to really come together in the way it did, and I mean, every time they kicked off to the kick returners, I mean, you could just see the level of skill. I mean, Nebraska's special teams unit were a lot of just in-state walk-on, guys that were not high-level pro pedigree bodies that, were making plays trying to tackle guys that ran 4.3 40s. I mean, who was it? Yeah. Was it Breston? Was that their kick returner?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, he was ridiculous.
Yes. Yeah, and because Breston's the old guy receiver and Manningham's the young guy, and they were very difficult to deal with, and you could tell where the speed gap was, but Nebraska just kept coming. You had at this point, Michigan takes the lead on a Manningham touchdown in the back of the end zone that is just an incredible catch. It's one of those give me that ball Moss situations. And now couple plays in the back of the end zone, very important, because you had the Manningham touchdown, but then Nebraska has an interception that, if not for replay, isn't an interception.
Yeah, and that replay was very new at that point.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't, I mean, it might have been in its first year, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it also negated a Michigan pick six, because there was I think it was the second Leon Hall interception, where he gets it and his knee's on the ground when he catches it. And so they bring it back.
Because ESPN aired that game, they had more cameras and more angles, where if that was your standard like Fox Sports package game back then, they may not have had all the angles, but that game had Mike Tirico, Kirk Herbstreit,
Aaron Andrews.
Was Aaron Andrews on the sidelines?
Yeah, she was.
So I mean,
it was an all-star team.
At the time when that game was over, it was ESPN's highest rated bowl game in history. This is pre BCS bowl game era, when ESPN didn't get those. So I mean, yeah, the stage it was on, I mean, it was an elite stage. The Alamo Bowl was full too. I mean, I'll never forget.
Oh, it was loud.
How many Nebraska fans went down there because they had just beaten Colorado, and just the excitement Nebraska fans had. They loved that bowl. I wish the Big Ten, or hope the Big Ten, can get the Alamo Bowl back, because that was always a great bowl game for Nebraska.
Well, it's kind of the perfect set, because it's a great walkable downtown. There's plenty of hotels. There's room, and it's actually, I believe, kind of a slow time of the year there, so you can get a decently priced hotel room. So you can walk around the Riverwalk. There's tons of restaurants, fun things to do. You can walk to the stadium, and the stadium's not huge, but it's big enough, and it gets really loud if there's most of the seats full. And so it's perfect if you've got a decent sized fan base, or if you've got, let's say, a Nebraska coming to play a team, in this case, Michigan, but let's say a Nebraska playing a more local team, like if Texas A&M were in it or something like that, if that's who they wind up going with. It's crazy. We don't even know what the bowl alignments are going to be down the road, but it can be super fun. Like, remember the RG3 Alamo Bowl? Like, that one was wild, and that the fans are going nuts in that one too.
Yeah, and the old Big 12, it was just such a natural bowl game for that league. And
yeah,
they would play a Big Ten. Nebraska played in that game 3 times, and all 3 times they won. They beat Michigan State with Pelini, and then they beat Northwestern when Northwestern shared the Big Ten championship in 2000. Dominic Raiola was on that team for Nebraska. So they were 3-0 in that game, and all 3 of those times, there easily had to be 30 to 40,000 Nebraska fans that made the trip to watch those games in the Alamo Bowl. And this one was no different, because of the momentum Nebraska had, just winning at Colorado to end the year. You kind of felt like things were turning a corner under Bill Callahan at that point. And this was rare. Nebraska and Michigan, they had the history going back to 97. And these 2 teams split the national championship. Nebraska won the coaches poll. Michigan won the AP poll. So they were split national champions in 97. And this would have been their first time ever playing since then. And we did a story back then on HuskerOnline where we did a roundtable with 3 or 4 Michigan players and 3 or 4 Nebraska players, just like who would win that game. And it was back and forth. And we actually interviewed Scott Frost on the roundtable back then.
Wow.
About Michigan, Nebraska.
Who would have won that
97 game?
That would have been a really fun game. Like, that would have been a fun game to put in the Alamo Bowl. Like, to be perfectly honest, you put it in that stadium, but you would have filled the Rose Bowl if you could have gotten those 2 together. And man, that would have been unbelievable. But what you got instead is, years later, you have this crazy, crazy game. So I mentioned that Mario Manningham catch. So that Mario Manningham catch in the back of the end zone happens with 6:31 to go in the third quarter. It makes it, after the extra point, is 21-17 Michigan. And then Michigan scores again to make it 28-17. And you mentioned feeling at times like in the fourth quarter, this game was over. So when that score happens, there's 11:40 to go in the fourth quarter. So much happens in that last 11:40.
Yeah, at 28-17, though, the way Michigan played and how disciplined they usually were, it should have been over. And that's why I always will remember this game. I'm like thinking to myself, there's no way Nebraska's going to have a chance to come back and win this game. And then, Corey Ross obviously breaks off a big touchdown run, and Michigan's defense started to get tired, and they started to have some breaks. And Nebraska obviously got the ball back again one more time to put the game away. And then their defense came up with stops. And I mean, it just was one of the more memorable fourth quarters of a game, in a game that really didn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, but it was very entertaining. And it was two of the winningest programs in college football who at that time rarely played against each other.
So, like you said, Corey Ross has the nice touchdown run where he kind of breaks loose down the left side. Michigan gives it back a couple times. The second time, though, is another replay one, by the way. Another replay. Now, I think they initially called this a fumble on the field, but replay confirms it because Tirico and Herbstreit were like, this isn't a fumble. This is an incomplete pass, because it was Henne was going back to throw, and the Nebraska defender gets him. He gets his hand on the ball before Henne can get the ball up above his shoulder. And it's a great shot. And you mentioned earlier, and let's explain this, Sean, as you and I are old guys in our 40s. Let's explain to the young folks what it used to look like watching a game. Like, there used to be like 3 cameras at a football game.
And they were very low quality. I mean, you think about Nebraska pretty much would have won another national championship in 1982 if there was replay. Penn State was out of bounds on any angle you ever watch in the 82 Nebraska Penn State game, and they counted it, and Penn State won the game on that play. And if there was replay, the play doesn't happen. And that 82 team is one of the more talented Nebraska teams in history, with Mike Rozier, Irving Fryer, Gale. You go down the line, Dave Remington, Baker Stein, or Dean Steinkühler, Roger Craig, and they lost on a phantom call at State College that if there was replay in that era, it doesn't happen. And Tom Osborne may have won his first national championship in 1982.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that just wasn't the capability wasn't there. You couldn't have gotten a crisp enough shot on a lot of these things.
No.
And that's what, like you mentioned, replay is a relatively new thing. HD technology is relatively new. Like, I remember covering the 2009 Alabama LSU game, and we were shocked to find out that at that point the SEC still hadn't switched to HD technology in the replay booth, because there was an interception or not in that game that was very controversial, and they're like, we don't have an HD shot. But the TV did.
Would have been HD. I mean,
right. This would have been one of the early HD games, one of the first ones,
because you had ESPN's prime setup there. I mean, it's like their Sunday Night Football level setup at the Alamo Bowl.
And the replay on this fumble, because this was probably the most important play of the game, because at this point, Michigan's still winning. They can put this away probably because of the way they play, because of the running game they have, the offensive line they have. But if this is a fumble, Nebraska gets it and they still have a chance. And it was a perfect shot where you could see the ball perfectly. It has not gone above Chad Henne's shoulders yet. He's not moving forward with his arm. It's a fumble. And Nebraska gets the ball back, and Zach Taylor takes him down the field.
And it was Blake Tiki on the hit, right? If I remember right.
I believe so, yeah.
A walk-on safety, just like a no-name guy making a play on an NFL high-level. I mean, you had a lot of guys like that stepping up in that game. But yeah, that final drive, just the way Zach Taylor, found Terrence Nunn for that final touchdown. I mean, it just was such a great moment at that time, just to see Nebraska drive down there and execute in that moment and put the game away. At least he felt like it was put away at that point. When he found Terrence Nunn, just with that strike right over the middle. All right,
let's get to the final play, because that's really that's where this game goes completely off the rails. It's what Scott Van Pelt calls pitchy woo woo. It is, had this worked, it would have been up there with Cal Stanford and the band is on the field. It would be one of those that is replayed in any highlight package involving college football ever. So Michigan runs a fairly conventional for a hook and lateral play, but Henne throws over the middle. Pitt, I believe the Pitt, it was breast and catching, pitching to Manningham, and then all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, just a ultimate rugby play. And there were about 2 or 3 moments where like, okay, it's over. And the fact that Michigan just kept it alive, I think everybody was in disbelief. I mean, the Nebraska players were in disbelief. You saw, Nebraska should have been penalized. I mean, they were
right,
on the field.
like Nebraska's sideline, like all the players had come onto the field. So what happened toward the end of the play? Like, so I don't even remember I have to look up where the play started. I'll tell you in a second the play started on Michigan's 37-yard line. They actually get it across midfield. I want to say they get it into the 40s, maybe even the 30s in Nebraska territory, and then they start going backward. And they're back behind the original line of scrimmage. They're probably in like the 25-yard line, the Michigan 25. And there's a player over on the far sideline, which is Nebraska's sideline, who throws it backward. It's still legal. Like, they haven't made it a legal forward pass yet. And it falls incomplete, but it's not incomplete because it's a fumble, because it's backward. And so, like, a lot of the Nebraska players, and I think some of the officials, and definitely at least one Michigan offensive line, which I think was Jake Long, because you see him just sort of standing with his hands on his hips, like, guess this is done. And Tyler Ecker is the player who picks it up for Michigan and just takes off like a bat out of hell toward the left sideline. And he's going, and he's like weaving through Nebraska players who aren't even in the play. They're just wandering around because they came off the sideline.
Yeah, it was the fact that and then all he had to do was make one more pitch back and they win the game.
Yeah. Zachary Bowman is the Nebraska player who knocked him out. I don't think Ecker saw Bowman. Bowman had like the perfect, and Bowman, like, if you ever saw the Terry Tate Office Linebacker series, it is one of those hits to knock him over the sideline.
And Bowman was a dude. I mean, he was a 5-star junior college corner, played in the NFL. So, like, I mean, he was not going to be easy to get by at that moment. I believe Titus Brothers was in the area too. I mean, he was a San Antonio kid that played for Nebraska. But just to see that all play out, because literally, you're right. I mean, we'd be talking about this play for 100 years if Michigan just makes one more pitch.
It's insane. Now, I got to ask you, what is it like watching that? Because the game's over.
How it is, you're down on the sideline at that point. So, like, you're almost kind of like, wait a minute. Like, it was just the way it was almost disbelief. Like, you're like, wait, they're almost going to do that. Like, you almost, then when Nebraska gets out of the situation there, you're like, wow, like, that almost just happened. I mean, probably like what Auburn and Alabama fans felt like on the kick six when they ran that. But I mean, you just a disbelief moment where you're like, there's no way. Or even this past year when Alabama was it fourth?
Oh, the 4th and 31. Yeah, fourth and goal from 31. Yeah.
It just should never. I mean, one in 1,000, this thing happens, and it almost happened in that situation.
Yeah, it's just wild. Now, coming off that win, where's Nebraska at? Because that's the sort of like, that's the kind of bowl win. And I don't know if we're going to do this anymore. Like, I don't know how this is going to work in the 12-team playoff era. But back in the day, that was the kind of bowl win where you go, that's the one you can build on. Like, that's how you build like, Bill Callahan's going places with Nebraska.
Yeah, that win at that moment. So going into 06, they had a really, really good team. I mean, lots of NFL talent. I mean, their defensive front returned Adam Carricker and Jay Moore and Stuart Bradley. All three of those guys played in the Senior Bowl that year. So, like, high-level NFL draft picks. They returned Zach Bowman at corner, and they had a number of really good linebackers coming back. Corey McEwen was all Big 12 at that time. Bo Rude. They were loaded across the board on that defense. Zach Taylor comes back. They add Maurice Purify, the best junior college receiver. That was a team that went, I believe, 10-4 the next year in 06. But they blew a huge lead at Oklahoma State. They blew the Texas game. Terrence Nunn gets a first down to ice the game, and he fumbles the ball. And Texas gets the ball back to win the game in Lincoln. The only team that really handily beat that Nebraska team that year was USC. They went out to the Coliseum, and they played a Pete Carroll level team.
Yeah.
And that's when they were at a whole nother level. But that was a Nebraska team the next year that easily could have and should have won the Big 12. They went to the championship game. They played the Oklahoma team that Rhett Bomar was suspended on for the car thing. And I believe Paul Thompson was the quarterback that year.
Right, yeah.
So they had a converted wide receiver.
That's the Oklahoma team that wound up playing Boise State.
Correct. And you could argue that Oklahoma team, in terms of Big 12 champions of that era, was probably one of the weaker Big 12 champions.
Right.
Because
Adrian Peterson was on the team, but was out for a lot of that season. Now he was playing at that point. I know he played in the bowl game.
Yeah, I don't think he played in the Big 12 title. It was freezing cold in Arrowhead Stadium.
Right.
And Nebraska had 60,000 fans in Arrowhead. It was unreal, and they blew that opportunity. So Bill Callahan, he talked about guys that were close. He brought talent to Nebraska, gets them into Arrowhead in front of 60,000 Nebraska fans in attendance, and they blew it against Oklahoma. They had every opportunity. They fumbled the opening play of the game, and Oklahoma jumped up 7-0. And from that point, that Nebraska still could. They were close. They still couldn't pull it out in the end. But yeah, that 05 game really set up a year in 06 where Zach Taylor was the Big 12 Player of the Year. Nebraska won the North, and they easily could have been in one of those BCS bowl spots back then.
And it was one of those times, and this would kind of hit Nebraska a few more times before this lull that they're currently in, where it would be like they were about to turn the corner, and then they just didn't. And that's where I now I feel like they're back in the about to turn the corner mode.
Right. Yeah. You have that, the feeling with Dylan Raiola and so much hope and optimism of what he's brought to the quarterback position. Now he's not named the starter yet, but usually your eyes don't lie. And he brings some intangibles that we haven't seen at that position. And they've upgraded the receivers. They've got a very good defensive group returning. I mean, I think this is a defense that could easily contend to be in the top 10 nationally, especially when you look at their schedule. They don't see a lot of elite offenses. They do play Colorado and they do play Ohio State, but they have a real opportunity to have one of the better defenses in the conference. And Dylan Raiola can do things at the quarterback position that we just haven't seen. So, this has a feeling of turn the corner for Nebraska, especially when you look at the first 7 games and the opportunity they have there in each one of those first 7 games.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting because if you read my calling my shot predictions for the season earlier this week, I did say I think Nebraska might go 7-0 to start the 2024 season. Now it's not a gimme. It's not a given.
No,
I definitely think it's possible.
Indiana, they're talking. Indiana fans have a lot of optimism that they have more on that roster than I think most understand. And I do think Rutgers and Lincoln will be a hard game, as you know.
Yep. Rutgers is better than people realize.
And Purdue's offense, I don't think they got their best receiver was out last year. He's back off injury. So
and Hudson Card's better. Yeah.
Purdue will have a very good improved offense. Now their defense is questions. In Colorado, who the hell knows what that team's going to look like?
Exactly. So we shall see, but this does feel like we're in that mode again of this is where Nebraska can turn the corner. So we will see if they can. Didn't happen after the Alamo Bowl, but we always remember the Alamo Bowl. I'm sorry, I had to. I'll see myself out. Sean Callahan, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Andy.
Thank you to Sean Callahan of HuskerOnline. Thanks again to Tim Watts of BamaOnline. That was a ton of fun. I love these games. I love this series. We're going to keep doing more of these. Don't worry if we haven't gotten to your team yet. We're going to get to your team. And if you've got some suggestions for ones you want us to do, by all means, you know where to find me. Andy_Staples on X, Andy_Staples on Instagram, Andy Staples On3 at gmail.com. Send me suggestions. I love these things. And we're definitely going to have some more points in the off season where we can do a couple more of these. Trust me, they're as much fun for me to do as they are for you guys to listen to. We'll be back on Monday with fresh shows coming off the holiday weekend. Things are starting to pick up. Big 12 Media Days is next week. Mountain West Media Days is next week. Pac-12, 2-pack, Pac-2. Their Media Days next week. It's all starting. We're almost there. We've almost made it. Talk to you next week.